failed, because the intention of God clearly isn't met. There's only one other possibility that happens. Now, a lot of people are in option 2. A lot of people are in option 2. Here's option 3, and this is the option I believe is biblical, and I think this is seen even in our text tonight. On the cross, Jesus Christ actually paid for the sins of some people. And I mean paid for the sins in a way that actually saves them, that actually justifies them. When Jesus Christ died on the cross of Calvary, He died for the purpose of redeeming those that the Father had given Him. If that sounds like a Bible verse, it's because it's where it came from. The wrath of God that was on the sins of those people that God had given Him for their sins was propitiated. It was extinguished at the cross of Christ. In this third option, and it's the only option where Christ's work on the cross actually does something for the sinner. It actually redeems the remnant. It actually redeems those people that they might not bow the knee to Baal, to this wicked world. When Christ paid for the sins of His people, He was at that moment redeeming sinners from the bondage of this world and bringing them into His possession. He was making them saints. On the cross of Calvary, Christ died to save, according, in verse 5, according to God's gracious choice, a remnant of people. And He died for those people alone. So here's the important question. How did the remnant come to be? Was it decided upon the sinner's acceptance of Jesus Christ? Is that how the remnant was decided? Or was the remnant decided by God's gracious choice? And we see in verse 11:5, to refresh our minds, in the same way then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. Just as God kept a definite number from worshiping Baal then, He has kept even today a saved remnant by His gracious choice. So that's the story of the ages. The believing remnant was not elected then or now by virtue of their spiritual worthiness or their morality or even on the basis of their racial descent. They were selected to be in the remnant based solely upon God's sovereign, elective, gracious choice before the foundation of the world, if that doesn't blow your mind. God actually chose those who would become the spiritual descendants of Abraham. So we've seen from this passage, I hope, we've all seen from this passage, two things so far. There has always been a remnant, and the remnant has always been chosen by God. And the last point tonight is that God's purposes have not failed because the remnant is saved by His grace. So verse 6 says this, "But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace." Now, if you're holding a King James Version, or a New King James Version, as I know Carl is, there is a second half of that verse that's not in any other modern translation. The second verse that Carl has says, "But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise, work is no more work." I'm not going to say too much about that. I just figured if some of you had it, you might wonder why I'm not saying anything about it. And that's because it's not in the NASB. The removal of the second half of this verse is probably because it was a copier's marginal note, but it's been argued by many that the second half of this verse is not found in the original text. So with that being said, the second half of this verse, I don't think it changes the meaning with it or without it. I'm just letting you know I'm not going to preach about it. That's all. We see in this verse the comparison of two opposites, grace and works. God's grace, human effort. Okay? The verse says, "But if it is by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace." Now, we have all known, in fact, we've all been people who have tried to marry together the two. We have tried to interconnect them into one package deal called our salvation. I know myself, that was the way I looked at it through my childhood. Christianity was this. What I need to do, I need to remove this sin, I need to change this habit, I need to give this amount, I need to perform these religious duties, and then once I've done that and I've escalated up the spiritual ladder, then God is going to recognize what I've done for Him, and at that point I will have reached a level that Christ is going to swoop in and pay for my sins, and then I'll be in God's family. But it's a marriage of what I've become and then what Christ does. He kind of pushes me over the limit and I'm saved. That's not biblical definition of grace or what the cross has done. The reason, as we see in our verse tonight, is because grace and works they oppose each other. They can't stand together. They have to be apart. The one repels the other. Once you establish grace as the basis of your salvation, you overturn works. If you try to establish works as your foundation for salvation, you overturn grace. So we'll talk about that for a few minutes. On Thursday, just to give you a little example of why this doesn't make any sense. If my boss came up to me on Thursday and gave me my paycheck and said, "Ken, actually, come here, I got a gift for you. And I really want you to have this. This is out of the kindness of my own heart. Here you go." And I open it up and it's my paycheck. That is not a gift. I earned that, right? That's my wage. That was the agreed upon terms, right? So that's kind of the basis of this verse. If I'm establishing what I'm deserved, what I'm owed based upon what I've done, if you give me what I worked for, that's not grace, right? I'm saying right a lot. As we see in verse 2 of our text, this grace from God was determined when? It was foreknown. This grace from God was determined before the foundation of the world. Okay? Remember when it was given to Jacob and Esau? It was given to the grace was given to Jacob before Jacob ever did an evil deed. It was given to Jacob before he ever could do a righteous deed. It also means that God elected to save before anyone could ever do a righteous deed. The teaching of the passage is that grace, from our passage tonight, was that grace was distributed to the remnant in God's foreknowledge before any of them were ever even born. That's why when Paul says, "But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace." This is what he's saying. He's saying God's grace stands alone from human works. The grace of God was established before works could even be done. Grace is the only remedy for our sinful problem. When God's wrath was propitiated on us, it was by the cross of Christ. And that was planned upon, before the foundation of the world. If our human works had anything at all to do with salvation, anything at all, there couldn't be grace. Why? Well, if our salvation depended on the basis of my religious works, then what I do becomes the hinge, really, of my future. And God can't be sovereign, because if God's going to give me the ability, the option to choose Him or to not choose Him, then really, He's not in the driver's seat. He's actually sitting back and waiting to see what I'll do. And then, if I do X, Y, and Z, that's correct, He owes me. Right? So there's not, again, like I'm trying to say, it's not, if you are starting to establish works as how you get saved, you are repelling grace. God elected to save some by His good pleasure. That is a grace